Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weep Union, and in this one there are several developments across the front line from the Sumi and Kursk regions in the north, the Kharkiv region in the northern parts of it, the eastern section of the front line from the northern to the southern outskirts of the Donetsk region. The Ukrainians managed to make a small advance within the Kursk region and on the western flank of Toretsk. Meanwhile, the Russians made numerous advances within the Donetsk region, around Toretsk, near Chesev Yar, east of Pokrovsk, and to the west of the Serbis River line. They advanced within Vovchansk, pushing the Ukrainians out of the northern parts of the town completely, and the Russians managed to advance within the Sumi region. At the same time, the Russians continue launching massive drone strikes over Ukraine night by night, where they recently launched over 400 drones. At the same time, the Ukrainians launched an operation called Operation Web. What is this operation? It is an operation where the Ukrainians detected several airfields where long-range Russian strike jets were located. They then opened up a manufacturing warehouse within Russia where they built their own drones. Then they put and set up several trucks that were to drive to each of these locations, where they then launched FPV drone strikes on the jets stationed at the airports very far from Ukraine, thousands of kilometers away. From this, we can see that the Ukrainians decided to take the advantage that is that the Russians have not built any hangars for their jets. At the same time, they barely have any defenses in these airfields because they are so far from Ukraine. These strikes resulted in numerous bomber jets either being destroyed or damaged. At the very least, based on this footage here, there are 8 visually confirmed destroyed or damaged. Some satellite imagery suggests the number is around 11. Ukraine first claimed 40, but in reality are claiming 13 now that are destroyed. So based on this, we can see that there are numerous destroyed and damaged, and this will have an effect on the Russian bombing capacity. However, the Russians still have about 80 to 100 additional operational bomber jets of the same types as the ones that were destroyed. And at one point in this war, the highest point at which they used the most bombers, it was around 2024. So they still have the capacity to do as they have been doing. They just don't have the capacity to do it 5 times as much as they have been doing. They can only do it 4 times as much this time around. This is still, however, a significant attack on the Russian bombing strike capacity. These jets easily value at $2 billion, while they were struck by drones locally manufactured, easily numbering around maybe $200,000, at most $2 million. This means that the damage is at least 1,000 times as much as what they have used to launch this strike. And they've also shown that it is possible to launch these sort of operations. Honestly, it's something that I have been expecting for a long time, ever since the Prigozhin march on Moscow. It makes sense that civilian-looking vehicles, if they bypass checkpoints, set up local workshops, or whatever they do, they can move close to these military sites, launch drone attacks, and with FPV drone strikes, it's very easy to actually hit your targets, especially if it's stationary. There's no electronic warfare, there's no air defense. Russian civilians went to these trucks to throw stones at the FPV drones as they were launching. This shows that the civilians were doing a better job defending these airfields than the Russian military, which shows despite firing many incompetent and corrupt commanders at the front line, the bureaucracy within the Russian military is still as corrupt as ever, being unable to build something as simple as a hangar to fortify multi-$100 million jets. As for the frontline developments, these operations have not had any effect on the front line at all. Instead, what we see is that the Russians continue their offensive operations. To the south of Novopil, the Russians are moving along the border area to gain control over the border between Donetsk and Zaporizhia. gaining control over these few forest lands and fields to the south of the town. To the northeast of Pokrovsk, the Russians gained control over Shevchenko-Persia, the forest lines and fortified positions in the vicinity of it, opening up the road to Kupcheve, which is the last target of the Russian forces besides that of Myrne, here in the western direction, to flank Pokrovsk from the east for the operational encirclement of the city. At the same time, positional fighting continues near Popivyar, Poltavka and Rusinyar. To the east, Russians have secured the remaining parts of Zoria, gaining control over the remaining parts of the town itself, leaving only the farm areas outside the town to the west and to the east remaining under Ukrainian control, following which the Russians would have an open road to Alexandro-Kalinove. To the west of Toretsk, the Russians managed to advance along the forest patch area, where they are flanking the Ukrainian foothold within the western parts of the city. At the same time, they lost control over the fortified positions to the west of that, as the Ukrainians launched a counterattack within the forest patch areas, where they're fighting over the western flank of the city. The Ukrainians are looking to have control over the roads leading into it, to have multiple supply lines into it, allowing them to diversify the logistical sources and move into the town from a wider area, while the Russians are looking to close off the flanks in the north and in the south to secure their positions and concentrate their forces towards the west. At the same time, the Russians made a significant advance to the north of Toretsk. They have been making several significant advances here in the northern flank of the city, securing the entire northern flank around Dashne, Drushba, Delivka and Krymske. And now they have managed to break through towards Delivka in the north, where they managed to gain control of several fortified positions and forest lines and entering the town itself. As we see with the geolocated footage, we can see that the Russians have broken through several fortified positions of the Ukrainians and are now fighting over the town of Delivka, gaining control over which will allow the Russians to flank the first Delivka closer towards Krymske and strengthen their advances in the northern direction towards Bilaora, where they can launch offensive operations towards that town as well, which will be the last one ahead of Kostantinivka from the southeast. The Russians will be looking to gain control over the remaining parts of the first Delivka, flank the fortified positions in between the two Delivkas, and gain control over the flank towards the second Delivka, while at the same time fighting over the town to gain control of it and secure the supply lines into it. This will allow the Russians to have a strong position in the northern flank of Toretsk and allow them to flank the fortified positions here to the west, where they look to advance along the railway area and up towards Ivanopilia, Pleshivka and the general supply lines here to the northwest of Toretsk, cut off the supply route from the north. Combined with assaults from the southwest, they'll be able to encircle the Ukrainian positions in Katerinivka, Klemenbyk, Sherbinivka, and Novospassky. To the north of Jasov Yar, the Russians continue their advances north of the city, following the capture of the apartment complex areas. In the central parts of it, the Russians are flanking the northern flank to advance along the canal on the eastern and western banks of it. Their objective is to gain control over Novomarkove, Markove, and Maiske, before moving westwards towards Klinove, Virulyubivka, and Popasne, gaining control over those towns as well as Stinky, Chervone, Mykolaivka further south, all the way down to Stupushki, will allow the Russians to have control over the northern flank of Kostantinivka for the operational encirclement of the city. We can see that the Russians are getting much closer to the operational encirclement of both Kostantinivka and Pokrovsk, where they're reaching the final stretch of pushes necessary for these operational encirclements. Especially in Kostantinivka, the Russians are advancing directly towards the operational encirclement of the city on both the northern and southwestern flanks of the city, while in the Pokrovsk direction it is more difficult for the Russians to get closer. It is heavily fortified and they also lack proper supplies in the area. The supply lines for the Russians are very long and sparsely populated. In the Pokrovsk direction, there's no major towns and cities in the area, while in the direction of Kostantinivka, there's Orlivka to the southeast, there's Bakhmut to the northeast, and the city of Donetsk directly to the south, allowing for multiple supply lines going into this section of the front line, allowing them to be heavily supplied and allowing for heavy artillery support and so on for their forces fighting in this section of the front line. This has allowed them to make significant advances in this section compared to the Pokrovsk direction, while the Ukrainians have also launched several counterattacks in the Pokrovsk direction to stabilize the front, similar to their operations within the city of Toretsk. which has significantly slowed down Russian advances. However, on the flanks, the Russians continue to advance with a significant pace compared to just a year ago. On the western bank of the Sirbis River line, the Russians broke through the forest lines here in the west of Rydkudov, where they managed to gain control over several forest lines and fields, and a foothold within Kharkivka on both banks of the river line. The Russians here have managed to gain control over approximately 30% of the town. As we see with this geolocated footage, the Russians are present on both banks of the river line. Gaining control over the town will allow the Russians to have a bridgehead across the next river line, at the same time to strengthen their flank of Rydkudov on the southern and northern flanks, which will allow the Russians to significantly improve their positions in the area, establish Nova as a supply hub for further offensive operations in the southern and western directions towards towns such as Zelenodolina, Sereshne, and Shentryholova. Further north in the direction of Vovchansk, the Russians managed to gain full control over the apartment complex area in the northern parts of the town. With this, the Ukrainians began a withdrawal from the northern bank of the Vovcha river line, where they have withdrawn their forces to the southern parts of the town. With full control over the northern parts of the town, the Russians will have a wide front line along the Vovcha river line, allowing for additional pushes in the eastern direction and attempts by the Russian forces to establish a bridgehead across. The town of Vovchansk has been completely destroyed from this year of fighting that's taken place within the town. Based on this, it is very difficult for the Russians to concentrate forces within it. But if the Russians are planning to strengthen their offensive operations in this section of the front line, they may be looking to widen the front line, establish additional pushes into the Kharkiv region from across the border, and establish a bridgehead across. This will allow the Russians to fight over the next defensive lines, establish themselves, entrench themselves within the southern parts of the town, will allow them to concentrate forces on a larger scale and push towards the next defensive line from multiple directions. Based on this, we can see that there is a possibility of strengthening the offensive operations in this section of the front line. With the concentration of forces along the border area, there is some possibility that this may happen. Further north in the Sumi, Toretsk parts of the front line, the Russians managed to gain control over the remaining parts of Kindrativka, which has strengthened their positions across the border area and will allow the Russians to start fighting over Andrivka, here to the east. Securing Andrivka and the forest lines in between Oleksivka and Kudrativka will allow the Russians to push further south towards Pisarivka, Khutin, and the towns along the main highway here in the southwest of Yanakivka. Also allow the Russians to flank towns such as Vereshne, Novomykolaivka, and Yablonivka here in between Yunakivka and Oleksivka. Based on this, we can see that the Russians will continue their offensive operations along the Sumi border area, where they have managed to gain more success and will slowly push their way forward, aligning the front line with the supply hubs such as Yunakivka and Kindrativka, which will both act as supply hubs for the Russian forces here on the Sumi side of the border. But at the same time, we see that the Ukrainians continue attempts along the border area into the Kursk region, where they managed to gain control over the water treatment plant here to the east of Titkino. With this, they are attempting to flank the town and cut off the supply lines. If they manage to cut off this road here to the north, they'll be able to encircle the Russian forces within Titkino. Therefore, we can expect that the Russians will widen their Sumi offensive to cover the flanks here to prevent the Ukrainians from gaining control over the border area, gain control over towns such as Titkino, Popovo, Lesashche, and to push the Ukrainians back out from the Kursk region in the area that is their final foothold across the border area. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.